Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. We're going to talk about America's veterans. And as most of you know, a vet is anybody who's ever served in the armed forces of the United States. I'm proud to be one. How about you? How many people, by just show of hands, how many people in the room are veterans who have ever been a vet? Great, great. I also want to recognize the members of my special studies class. Anybody in the special studies class, you want to raise your hands too? Yeah. You see, I bring my audience with me. You know, Americans often glorify soldiers while battles rage and express token gratitude for their service, especially during observances of Veterans Day or Memorial Day, but quickly forget about veterans when the guns fall silent. But what now? As our country becomes a nation at peace with being continuously at war. When war claims a soldier's life, what does that death signify? What is the meaning of a veteran's service? What now in 2016? When a year in a war zone, followed by a year at home, often followed by orders back to war, is the new normal for active duty soldiers. The effects of multiple combat tours has been horrifying, according to several professional soldiers, and you've heard some of them this week. Troops beset with demons caused by post-traumatic stress, PTSD, and by traumatic brain injury, TBI, have turned increasingly to alcohol and drugs. The statistics released by the Defense Department and by the Department of Veterans Affairs during the past 4 years have been really tragic and staggering. Divorce rates among Afghan and Iraq war vets have increased by as much as 42%. PTSD among vets has increased to epidemic proportions. And according to a lot of research, more than 360,000 veterans may be suffering from TBI, traumatic brain injury. And as you heard this week from several sources, suicides have skyrocketed. Every day, approximately 22 veterans commit suicide in the United States, according to a study released by its own Veterans Administration Office. This grim statistic prompted talk of a veteran suicide epidemic and served as a call to action for veterans advocacy. Boy, I'm having trouble this morning with words. Advocacy groups. When we talk about veterans groups, we're talking about the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Vietnam Vets of America, and yes, there's even an organization for Iraq and Afghanistan vets. CNN posted on an article on their website a couple of years ago that said that we're losing more people now, more veterans, to suicide than we are people in combat, especially the people ages 18 to 24, our young people. The American public is beginning to realize that a military career is not something to look forward to. In a 2012 survey of America's worst jobs, soldiering placed third worst. Only lumberjacking and dairy farming were considered worse. Healthcare for veterans of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan have increased beyond expectations, the healthcare needs for these veterans. Among the leading indicators of how bad veterans' healthcare has gotten, between 2000 and 2010, disability claims by veterans quadrupled. The VA has been slow to react to this healthcare crisis. The government is not fulfilling its contract with veterans to provide care. And since a quarter of the approximately 2.3 million Afghan and Iraq war vets have claimed a service-connected disability, a figure to increase as that population ages, things will only get worse. It's important to note that the claims of veterans do not reach their peak until about 30 or 40 years after a conflict has ended. In my own case, I waited 45 years after I left Vietnam, 45 years to make a disability claim. Clearly, costs will continue to rise. One estimate of the total disability claims stemming from all the so-called long wars of the early 21st century, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. When the last bill comes due decades from now, it is believed that the total bill will approach $1 trillion. You know, since the founding of the Republic, veterans have had to fight for their benefits, and their success at receiving those benefits has depended less on the country's conscience than on political circumstances and expediency. When there have been large numbers of returning soldiers, especially draftees, and they have been well organized, the veterans have fared well. But when veterans have represented only a small percentage of the population and have been volunteers, as they are today, an all-volunteer force, or if they lack political clout, their needs have gotten short shrift. One indication of their current lack of clout is the decreasing numbers of veterans serving in the U.S. Congress. Shortly after the draft ended in 1973, we had as many as 77% of the Congress were veterans, a total of 412 veterans of the Congress out of a total of 535 members. Compare that impressive, or those figures to today's total. Only 19% of our legislators are veterans, 19 in the Senate, and they're getting older by the day, and 85 in the House of Representatives, for a total of only 104 compared to 412 years ago. Afghan and Iraq veterans are just beginning to take the place of vets from World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Today, there are 16 Afghan and Iraq vets in the House of Representatives. 16, just 3% of the Congress. None currently serve in the Senate. The veteran who is a survivor of Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan carries within himself the special taint of his war. Pain and alienation are just two of the feelings suffered by these vets. And combat vets carry inside them additional zones of rage and violence, for they have known friends who died unnecessarily. Some of them daily confront the absurdity and horror of war and the struggle to regain their pre-war feelings and develop a new sense of themselves and their world. Coming home sometimes can also be a struggle. The return of the soldier from war has always been one of the more moving ceremonies of war. Tearful women, proud men, excited children. But Vince Torello's homecoming was no big deal, for his remains came home in a closed casket. First Lieutenant Vincent A. Torello, my Air Force partner in 1966, died in the Vietnam War. He wasn't shot in battle, he didn't pilot a plane, and he didn't commit suicide. He died because of the flip of a coin. Can you imagine that? A coin toss determined life or death. It all happened when he and I were sent to Vietnam. The following are two examples of forgotten warriors based on my own personal experiences. As an Air Force intelligence officer, I arrived in Saigon in December 1965, just before Christmas and just in time to see comedian Bob Hope and his troupe perform in front of 20,000 soldiers, sailors, Marine, and airmen in the Vietnamese hot sun at an airbase known as Tan Son Nhut. My form of transportation to Southeast Asia was a civilian World Airways DC-8 jet plane that was chartered by the U.S. military. It took 200 of us from Travis Air Force Base, just outside of San Francisco, halfway around the world and across the Pacific to Tan Son Nhut, which is on the outskirts of Saigon. Author Joseph Conrad would have felt right at home in Saigon, hot and humid, dank in corners, suspicious with intensity. The city seethed with dark energy, and as I was about to learn, one wasn't safe anywhere. Aboard the chartered aircraft were men and a few women from all over America. 18-year-old kids from hamlets in West Virginia, 20-year-old college dropouts, 20-year-old college dropouts from Philadelphia, farm boys from Iowa and Nebraska, and for me, I was 25 and a college graduate. Despite the good-looking stewardesses on the plane and lots of those ubiquitous small bottles of liquor to drink, it wasn't a pleasant ride. And despite the fact that every seat was taken, the passenger cabin of the DC-8 was quiet. There were few sounds during the long flight across the Pacific. Contemplating one's life in a war zone and the likelihood of one's death is best done in silence. Actually, those of us heading for Southeast Asia were just plain scared. With military orders raiding Vietnam, most of the men had no idea of what the land would be like, what would be asked of us, or how we would respond. Unlike the others on the plane that day, I knew something about where we were going. For as a college student, I had studied the history, people, and cultures of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And I had studied the war that the French had lost the previous decade and how we Americans thought we knew better, how we had come to replace the French when we helped to divide the country in two into North and South Vietnam in 1955. But for all my knowledge, I didn't listen to the advice first offered by Groucho Marx. Be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. Instead, I actually volunteered to be sent to Southeast Asia. As we flew over the first landmass we had seen in many hours, I guessed that we almost had arrived. The world below, Vietnam the country, looked green and inviting, not like Vietnam the war, the dangerous place about which I had been warned. In the days ahead, I was to learn the truth about Vietnam, that the land was on fire, a fire that we Americans were not capable of extinguishing, a fire that was soon to devour many of us who were on the plane that day. Quote, "The Department of Defense regrets to inform you," the official letter began, "that your son, U.S. Air Force First Lieutenant Vincent A. Chiarello, FV 3136108, is officially listed as missing in action. U.S. forces have had no contact with him or any of his crew for several days, and it is believed that his aircraft was shot down over North Vietnam on or about 29 July 1966, unquote. The letter, which was delivered in person, could have given the Chiarello family a fuller explanation, but it didn't. The Air Force would not have had to reveal any classified or sensitive information by adding that the aircraft on which Vince, an intelligence officer, was an EC-47, similar to a two-engine commercial DC-3. It became unaccounted for within 2 hours of when it left its base at Udon, Thailand, that July afternoon. The Air Force could have emphasized in the letter to Vince's mother that it was exhausting all possible means to search for the plane. However, since its flight path took it over mountainous terrain with very thick vegetation, American aircraft were having a difficult time searching for the missing plane. The Air Force could have added that the enemy action which the unarmed EC-47 likely encountered was a North Vietnamese MiG jet fighter, and therefore there was little likelihood for the survival of any of the 8 men on board. And it was confirmed years later that all 8 died even before the plane crashed. Finally, it also would have been more considerate if the Air Force official in charge of this notification to the next of kin had indicated that he shared the family's concern, very much regretted the situation, and promised to keep the family informed about the status of their son. But he didn't. 22 years later, in June 1988, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Trello, promoted in absentia, came home. At least part of him came home. After years of searching, his remains and some parts of several other men who were on that ill-fated plane were found, flown to the military forensic lab in Hawaii for identification, and returned to next of kin. In Vince's case, he came home to a small cemetery in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in a closed casket. And I was there, having read of his homecoming in a Philadelphia newspaper. Why was I there? That's another story. Vince Trello died on a Friday. It was a hot and steamy July day, like any other Friday in Southeast Asia in 1966. That Friday, July 29th, an Air Force EC-47 designated with the code name Dog Patch was assigned the mission of contacting a Central Intelligence Agency, a CIA, road watch team by flying over their position in northern Laos, not in Vietnam, but in northern Laos. My boss, Colonel John Bridge, approached Vince and me to see if one of us wanted to go on this particular mission. It was an unusual offer. Normally, our duties were fairly straightforward. Vince and I briefed pilots before takeoff, debriefed them after they returned from their missions over North Vietnam, but hardly ever had the opportunity to go out on a mission. Being unconcerned about our own mortality like most 26-year-olds, both Vince and I expressed enthusiastic interest in joining Dog Patch's crew. But Colonel Bridge explained there was room on the plane for only one of us. It already had a crew of 7. So who was it to be? Vince or me? We both were first lieutenants, equally qualified intelligence officers, and we both volunteered. The best way to determine which one would go seemed to be a coin toss. I don't recall which one of us had the coin, a tie bot. In any case, the colonel flipped it, and Vince won. A little while later, I accompanied him to the flight line where the EC-47 was getting ready to take off, wished him well, and requested a personal debriefing when he returned. And then he was off. I had no idea that that would be the last time I saw him. Quote, the family of the late Lieutenant Colonel Vincent A. Trello, unquote, the memorial card read that I received 22 years later in July of 1988, appreciates your expression of sympathy, caring, and concern at the time of his homecoming. Tucked inside was a smaller card with 2 prayers on it and the dates of Vince's birth and death. There also was a handwritten note from his brother, which read, our phone conversations, your presence at the funeral, and visits to my home have all helped our family to better cope with Vin's homecoming. We know that you, above all, have lived and felt the frustration and pain that my family has lived with for the past 22 years. We feel much more peaceful now, knowing that Vin is safely home with the Lord. The funeral of the previous month was especially difficult for me. After all, when I looked at Vince's casket, the reflection I saw was me. For had it not been for the flip of a coin in 1966, it might well have been me rather than Vince, that friends and relatives were bidding farewell. What have we learned from Vince Torello's sacrifice and the deaths of over 58,000 Americans in Vietnam? What will be the legacy of those of us who were sent to fight a half century ago? Maybe our legacy is somehow connected to the commemoration of Memorial Day, a day when we remember and honor all those whose courage and devotion to duty caused them to make the ultimate sacrifice. It's a day when some of us feel particularly haunted by the past, a day when my memory takes me back to Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Most of us are creatures of our time. I've been fortunate to personally have known many individuals who I consider to be creators of their time. Like the relatives of the vanquished of war, I miss these individuals, sons and pilots, husbands and fathers, brothers and airmen. While I miss them, it is comforting to know that their legacies will outlive us all. For as a friend once said, people live in deeds, not in time. As long as we, the living, do not betray the ideals of those we've lost, as long as we approach their lives with integrity and honesty, their spirit will live on. The lives of those who have died challenge us, not only to remember them, but to give meaning to their lives. For as a poet has suggested, their lives will mean what we make of them. On this day, I especially recall Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Torello, my Air Force partner when we shared intelligence duties in Saigon and at Udon, Thailand, 50 years ago. It seems impossible that it's been 50 years. Because of a quirk of fate, a flip of a coin, I came home from Southeast Asia alive instead of him. Like me, Vince was a college graduate, an Air Force intelligence officer working with the CIA, the agency that was primarily responsible for coordinating the war in Laos. But unlike me, he was on a volunteer mission aboard an unarmed aircraft that was shot down over Laos with the loss of 8 lives. For 22 years, the status of these 8 men continued to be forgotten warriors, listed only as MIA, missing in action, until Vince's remains were recovered in a foreign field and returned to American soil in June of 1988. His mother, Mrs. Ann Torello, who lived in Bucks County, never ceased to work on behalf of her son and the other families of the missing of the Vietnam War as an active member of the organization known as the Gold Star Mothers. She was a remarkably strong lady, one I was proud to call Mom when I came back. Everyone she touched became strengthened and more loving for the experience. The last time I saw Mrs. Torello was 25 years ago, in 1991, at a ceremony involving the Moving Wall, a half-size replica of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, while it was in Philadelphia. She had accepted my invitation to visit the wall and pay our respects to her son, whose name is inscribed on panel 9 East, line 85, of what has become the most visited memorial in our nation's capital. She was happy to see her son's name again, to be in the presence of other Gold Star mothers, and to share some powerful feelings with others who know the meaning of the word sacrifice. Now, years later, mother and son are buried next to each other in the same quiet Newtown, Pennsylvania cemetery. Looking back, it is truly astonishing how much each of them taught me with their dying. Many of us who have survived wars believe that the difficult events of our lives teach us to have the courage to accept history, to love one's own time without vain regrets, and to accept the fact that life is a gift and a richness that must be given, whether the times are peaceful or troubled. For those of us sent to war, most felt forgotten by the nation that sent us. I believe that's true regardless of the war's name: Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam. In the case of Southeast Asia, almost 60,000 American soldiers died and another 300,000 were wounded. But this doesn't even begin to compare with over 2 million Vietnamese who died, or the hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians caught up in the war. As one veteran has written, quote, "Vietnam succeeded only in leaving a legacy of bitterness and unacknowledged sacrifice," unquote. If this is difficult to understand, read Sebastian Junger's new book, Tribes, about the alienation many of us felt coming home from Vietnam. Sadly, this is nothing new. I also can recommend Ernest Hemingway's evocative short story, Soldier Home, about a veteran returning home from World War I. Same situation. Wars continue to permeate the lives of veterans and their loved ones. But at least in the case of Vietnam, the healing process has begun. It is time to add to the growing perception that regardless of one's view of the war, most vets served honorably. While this is not a day to review our political feelings regarding America's wars, it is a time to ask questions of our history, of the way our veterans are treated, of our responsibilities toward them. Throughout our nation's history, one of its most constant supporters has been its veterans. And once again, American men and women are serving their country far from home. 50 years ago, as a young Air Force officer, I received orders to go to Vietnam. I will never forget the haunted men from that time, that war and other wars, other generations. Gaunt and tired, used up, feeling empty and lonely. Vets also have a passion for short bursts of truth, for shouting commands, for hating bureaucracy, for alleviating the suffering of civilian and military war wounded, and for those victims who have been reduced to war-torn and homeless refugees. Veterans have supported with spirit America's sense of mission and have kept faith with presidential pronouncements and commitments, all in the name of protecting American interests. Veterans are touched by all the events of their time, are in the midst of its movements, organizations, and ideas, and their actions proclaim the spirit of the time. Unfortunately for some in business with available jobs, American vets are either unknown soldiers or of past wars or unwanted soldiers of an unpopular war. While some veterans have retreated into feelings of mistrust and denial, more and more vets understand that the way to redeem our past is by linking it to the future. For many veterans of Southeast Asia, however, Vietnam is still their enemy. The war that never was declared has never ended, is how one observer put it. Vietnam, the country, has been transformed into Vietnam, the lesson. Many Americans still do not want to know anything about what is going on with our all-volunteer military in Iraq and Afghanistan, or Vietnam and what it did to them and their friends and relatives. But the day will come when they will and must. For the words of de Tocqueville, written in the 19th century, retain their pertinence. Quote, "A democracy can obtain truth only as a result of experience, and many nations may perish while awaiting the consequences of their errors. The great privilege of the Americans does not consist of being more enlightening than other nations, but in being able to repair the faults they may commit," unquote. I hope those words still ring true. Remembering veterans past also means to recall past adventures and misadventures. Nevertheless, the legacy of the overwhelming majority of vets is one of duty, honor, country. The Vietnamese have a saying, quote, "It is only in winter that you can tell which trees are evergreen," unquote. So it is that in times of trial and burden, veterans always will stand with America. Like the evergreens, their presence and love of country will stand out. They were and are the citizens who put themselves in harm's way so that others may remain free. Remembering their voices and their silences, the time is long past for the million of our nation's veterans to emerge from the shadow of all our wars, declared and otherwise. And while it is too late to save the lives of the casualties of war, it is not too late to rescue the memories of our forgotten warriors. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions that you have, if anybody would like to raise their hand. Yes, sir. Dan.
I was wondering if the numbers of veterans with problems and all these distresses that you said, percentage-wise, seem very high at the present time and in the present wars we've been having and conflicts. Is there a reason why they may be higher than they were in previous wars and combats?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. As far as veterans are concerned, coming home, you know, when you came home from Vietnam and when people are coming home from, mostly from Iraq and Afghanistan, although there are some exceptions, people are not treated very well. There are no parades. Nobody is saying anything other than thank you, maybe occasionally. But in terms of the service, in terms of what's going on when you're in the service, we didn't have things called traumatic brain injury. People got it, but they didn't call it. They didn't diagnose it. And they did not diagnose PTSD until later in the Vietnam War. So I think there was a problem with diagnosis when people were at war. You know, we had a movie called Concussion where people are playing football were seen having concussions and nobody realized they were having concussions until people started dying from these things. Sometimes we're slow to recognize these things, but I also think that, yeah, I should stay here, you're right. Sorry about that. I think in some ways we're slow to recognize these symptoms. In another way, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been extremely violent, extremely. I mean, we're talking about people getting blown up a lot, these mines that are planted out there, these improvised devices. In Vietnam, we had landmines. In World War II, we had landmines, but it just seems to me the wars have gotten a lot more violent, a lot worse in terms of the people fighting them. And I don't think we're prepared to, I don't think we're protecting our people enough. I really don't. Not sure what you can do. Chaz?
Ira, following up on that question, you did mention the fact that in the more recent wars we've had a lot of redeployments. Can
Right.
you speak to how that may have impacted?
Yeah, thank you. I think the deployments and redeployments have impacted. I mentioned that people have been sent to war maybe for 6 months, maybe for a year, and then they come home and they're home for a short while and then they're sent for another deployment. We seem to be constantly at war. The only people that are aware of this are the people that are fighting the war and the friends and relatives of people who are in our all-volunteer force. We don't have a draft anymore. Most people are not aware really of what's going on. There are items in the paper, but people really don't pay much attention to what's going on. But the guys who are fighting it and the relatives, they see it. And there's no question that psychologically, physically, it's much more draining on soldiers to come home for a short while and go right back out again, and to know that you're going to go back out again, that there's no question you're going to be redeployed. We have a smaller army these days than we had during Vietnam. There was a point when we had 500,000 men in Southeast Asia. We don't have that many men in Afghanistan or Iraq today, but they're under, I think, more pressure than ever. And I think going back and forth is part of that pressure. Yes, sir.
It seems that we now are in a different era or stage. All of the servicemen are volunteers.
Right.
Previous, we had the draft. The black congressman from Harlem, I can't think of his name at the moment, was very, very demanding, saying that we need and we should go back to a draft. It almost occurs that serving in the service is a new profession because it's all volunteer.
That's right.
And the public is not really involved in what's going on.
That's right.
Is this a political thing? Is this just a happenstance? What is your feeling on that? Should there be a draft?
1973, Richard Nixon was in real trouble, and so he helped Congress to get rid of the draft. People's bodies bags coming back from Vietnam certainly helped to decide that. So let me ask all of you, by show of hands, how many would be in favor of some form of national service? Either you serve 2 years, right? See, look at this. Look, I mean, there's no question about that. Most people, our generation, are in favor of that, not necessarily younger people. But we think that certainly 2 years of national service, whether it's AmeriCorps, helping to build communities inside America, whether it's the Peace Corps, whether it's military, but some form of national service would be very helpful. Yes, sir, all the way back there.
I served in the Army in Europe. My landlord's son was conscripted for 18 months of service to the German Army prior to being allowed to go to the university. There was a mandatory pathway through the military before he was allowed to go to higher education.
In Germany?
In Germany. Yeah. Now, I don't know if that policy is still intact, but that's the form of service.
Right. Israel, everybody has to serve, men and women. There are a few exceptions, there are some, but mostly everybody serves. There are countries where everybody serves, and maybe they have a better sense of their own country, I don't know. But we decided, as a Congress representing us, we decided that we didn't want to have a draft anymore. I think mainly it was a result of the Vietnam War. I think we wanted to get out of that war. Yes, sir.
In light of all the negative publications about how veterans are treated, the problems that they have, the poor treatment they get at the VA, has the enlistment rate today declined? And are we seeing a decline in willingness to join the services?
I'm not sure about the enlistment rate. I haven't checked that.
Yes.
I think it is yes. I think by logically, I think it would decline, especially when you hear about so many people getting killed and so many terrible injuries. One of the things I didn't point out is that we have better medical care today in war zones than we've ever had before. In World War II, I used the example in my class of Gettysburg. In Gettysburg, you had approximately 50,000 men that died in 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg because there was very little medical attention, almost none. And people mostly died of their wounds. They didn't die instantly, they died over 3 days. We lost a little bit more than 50,000 men in Vietnam over a period of about 15 years. We had pretty good medical care. We had helicopters that rushed people back to MASH units. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we have even better medical care. So as a result, the wounded are being treated right away and are surviving, but they're surviving with terrible wounds. I think people see this, and I think there is a less of an interest people joining. So I think Dan is probably right that the enlistment rate probably has gone down. I'm not sure what the Army can do about this. You know, if it's being sent to fight wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, it's just a very terrible situation. It really is. Yes?
In World War II, they called it battle fatigue.
Right.
Do you know if there was a higher incidence in the South Pacific where you couldn't see the enemy as opposed to the European theater where you pretty much knew where they were except for the Battle of the Bulge?
I don't know if anybody wants to join in on that. We, over the years, World War I, World War II, Korea, we certainly called things battle fatigue, a certain feeling that you had that you're at the end of your rope. Now it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. For the most part, there are some exceptions, but you may recall the scene in the movie Patton, where Patton slaps a boy that looks fine. He doesn't look like he has a wound, but psychologically he's undergoing a lot of stress and he is having major problems and he just can't do anything other than cry. That's all he can do. That kid was called, his condition was called battle fatigue or shell shockness or something, but it's the same thing as PTSD. I think much more serious are these traumatic brain injuries. When people are in Humvees or they're in tanks or they're in some sort of armored vehicle and the vehicle goes over a mine or goes over an improvised device that explodes, an IED, and everyone gets a ringing in their head, blood comes out of their ears, and then they look like they're okay, but they're not okay. And if some doctor was nearby and could set up brain waves or something, they would see how their brain has been affected by this explosion. We get a lot of those kind of injuries, and as I mentioned, it's estimated almost 400,000 veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have TBI, traumatic brain injury, which is like a concussion, very serious. Yes, ma'am, all the way back.
There is something that I sort of think about the PTSD is the people that have died but are not dead. I mean, you're living with a person that is just almost like a vegetable, but they're not dead.
Well, clearly, if you're living with somebody who has PTSD, who really is not themselves, who really is having difficulty being in the moment, finds him or herself back in Vietnam or back in Iraq or Afghanistan, the person should go to a Veterans Administration hospital, to a PTSD ward, and seek help. It's difficult to get people to seek help. It's not an easy path.
I think he waited probably too long.
I had friends pushing me to go and to see somebody for 45 years, and I didn't. 45 years, you know. And I'm mostly okay, mostly. I mean, think about the other people, you know. Yeah, no, we're not going to vote on that. No, we're not gonna. My class has a sense of humor. Yes, Eldon.
In Vietnam, I don't think that Lyndon Johnson pursued the war vigorously to a conclusion. He pursued it to just fend things off. And when I heard Petraeus yesterday say, I think we have a generational war. It's not going to be a year, it's not going to be 5 years.
Yeah.
What do to the mind of the soldier who realizes that we're not just going to finish this?
And that's why I said we're a nation of peace and endless war, you know. As far as Johnson's concerned, I think he wanted the war to get over really quickly. He wanted to get reelected, you know. I don't know about that. Certainly, a lot of military people think that that in some cases their hands were tied. I don't think their hands were tied. We bombed North Vietnam back to the Stone Age. But in the case of Vietnam, it was their country, their people, and they were going to keep fighting forever. There was just no question about that. As far as today is concerned, I don't know. Petraeus is probably right that we're going to be in wars for a long time to come. As long as we view, you know, countries don't have friends. They have interests. One of the things that my friend Bob Hopper has taught me. And if our interests are defined as helping Yemen and helping Pakistan and helping Sudan and helping countries all over the world to gain some sort of democracy or to have the kind of government that we want them to have, if we define our interests that way, then we're going to be all over the world for a long time, and we're going to be involved in a lot of wars. I'm not saying that we should pull back and that we should be isolationists. I think we should pick our battles very carefully, and I think we need better strategy for dealing with those battles. You take a look what's been going on in Iraq as a good or bad example. We had a lot of people in Iraq. We started pulling them back. ISIS started building up. We recognized ISIS much too late, and we started fighting them. We had surges, we had desurges, you know. Not a very good strategy for fighting a war. So hopefully a new president hopefully will take a new look at our responsibilities, our commitments around the world. The military will follow whatever the president says. The military will follow up on our commitments. I just wish that we didn't ask the military to do things sometimes that other agencies should do. For example, drones is a good example. Instead of the military sometimes using the drones, maybe the CIA should do it. Instead of the military being involved in helping to build houses and villages, maybe Agency for International Development should be involved in that. The military is being asked to do a lot of things that it wasn't originally asked to do back in 1776 or in the 1800s or in the 1900s. And I think there's much more pressure put on the military today than ever before. Bob?
Do you think that active military officers and the services actually lobby enough on behalf of veterans? It seems to me that once you're out, that if you're a colonel or a general, you don't care very much about the veterans anymore.
Bob is suggesting that the current military officers, the leaders of our
And
Army.
always, I'm not accusing this current.
Right, that the leaders of our military, the leaders of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, that they don't lobby enough, they don't do enough, they don't work with the Congress enough to make sure that guys, once they get out of the service, are getting all the benefits they need. And clearly it looks like that. What goes on behind the scenes, of course, we don't know. I'm sure there is some lobbying that goes on by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and by his staff. But clearly there doesn't seem to be enough going on for the benefit of veterans, not just for the guys in the military on active duty, the volunteers, but for people who have gotten out of active duty. Clearly the Veterans Administration is not their best friend sometimes. Sometimes the VA is, but we see too many examples where the VA has not fulfilled its contract and has not protected, has not given the veterans that have asked for help, and again, there are too many veterans that don't even ask, but has not helped the veterans who really do need help. Yes, sir.
Reserve Officers Association has both active reservists and retired reservists. It's a very, very active political action committee.
Right.
There are a number of organizations. I think part of what you alluded to earlier is that the war has changed. We don't understand what today's warrior goes through. Unless you've got skin in the game, a son, a daughter, or you've been there,
Right.
You don't appreciate what that duty has to, what is entailed in that duty.
Yeah, I agree. The problem, though, is what Bob is pointing out is that, yes, we have veteran advocacy groups. We have the Reserve Officers Organization. We have veterans groups like VBA, like American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars. They all do lobbying. And most of the lobbying is very good. Most of the lobbying is on behalf of veterans, and sometimes it's also on behalf of active duty people. But what about the leaders of our military, the people who are leading the military, the guys who are wearing uniforms? They're in Congress, they're up in Congress, and they're giving testimony to the Armed Forces, Armed Services Committees for benefits for people currently in active duty, but what are they doing for veterans? And I would suggest to you that they're not doing very much for veterans. They're mostly concerned about guys in active duty, and probably that's the way it should be, but it would be nice to hear them speak out about veterans too. Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to say that we have fewer veterans in Congress now than we've had in a long time?
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. The high water mark, as I say, was 1977, when we had 77% of the Congress were veterans, guys from World War II and Korea and Vietnam. But today we're down to 3%, and I think it's going to get even lower. Veterans, for a lot of reasons, veterans are not interested in getting involved in politics. Their one experience with the government was not necessarily a good one. And it's difficult. We have a few people in Congress who really speak out, Representative Duckworth, a few others. But for the most part, when veterans come home, you know, they want to reestablish themselves with their families, and the last thing in the world they're thinking about is running for office, which is a tough thing to do. I've been involved in a lot of political campaigns because I think it's the only way to make changes in this country. Not just the best way, but the only way. And I think it's important for every one of us, number one, to vote, and number two, to get involved in somebody's campaign, whoever's campaign, whether it's tax collector in your local town or a campaign for president. But I think we all have an obligation as citizens to get involved. But it's tough coming back. Yes, you want to follow up?
Would it be fair to say that a lot of these people that are in Congress and have reached the higher levels are those that grew up through the anti-war demonstrations and anti-war sentiment of the 60s?
Not necessarily. I mean, you take a look at the majority in both the House and the Senate are Republicans who, again, as a general statement, I would say definitely we're not anti-war people. I think they're among the group that says, you guys go. I mean, we shouldn't go, but you guys should go, you know, and they supported the war. I really feel that way. Yes, sir.
The reason we have less servicemen in Congress is because of the pool that's available. After World War II, 95% of the men walking around were ex-servicemen. In Vietnam War, it was even less. In the Korean War, it was even less then. So the pool that's available of ex-servicemen to become politicians is a lot less. So that's a natural phenomenon.
Right. There are two reasons. That's one of the reasons. The other reason that we have fewer people in the Congress is that clearly the people who did serve are getting much older and are retiring. So you have both people retiring and you have a smaller pool. And as a result, you have fewer people. Yes, ma'am, all the way in the back.
Maybe this has already happened. And
That's
I
okay.
didn't see the program, but wouldn't this general topic be an excellent subject for programs like 60 Minutes or Dateline?
I think we've probably had that on those programs, but I'm not a producer of TV. John, you hear that? We should have this as one of our programs. John V. and I produce a program called Chautauqua People, which is on closed circuit TV here, and you can get it on YouTube. Just go on YouTube and
We broadcast on Access Channel 5. It'll be on the Access Channel 5 website, Access YouTube. So this program will be available.
yeah. Thank you for the suggestion. Next time I talk to somebody in Dateline, I'll suggest it to them. Yeah. No, I don't think so. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your interest. I'm asking my class to stick around. I want you to know you're also in a special studies class, so don't go away. If you want to stick around, I'm sticking around too. Okay. Yes, Sarah?
Are you going to make that speech available anywhere? Have you typed it up and...
This is how I typed it up.